Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 17 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Parlez-vous Français? Do you speak French? Believe it or not, there was a time when the United States spoke French. Perhaps not linguistically, but culturally, artistically, and gastronomically. Today we speak with François Furstenberg, an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. François is the author of When the United States Spoke French, 5 Refugees Who Shaped a Nation. In today's episode, François will reveal how 5 French aristocrats, early leaders of the French Revolution, were forced to flee France during the 1790s and why they chose to settle in the United States. How these 5 Frenchmen and their fellow exiles influenced American art, culinary tastes, fashion, and culture, and why many Americans opted to embrace French culture during the 1790s and how it helped them define their early identity as Americans. And as a bonus, François will also reveal how Napoleon Bonaparte almost settled the Louisiana Territory instead of selling it to Thomas Jefferson and the United States in 1803. But first, I have a modern-day discovery to share with you.
After studying all the best available news, foreign and domestic, Liz has a modern-day discovery to share with you.
Would you enjoy the opportunity to spend a day engaging with and discovering history with historians and fellow history lovers? If so, you should check out the 2nd annual History Camp. History Camp 2015 will take place in Framingham, Massachusetts on March 28, 2015. History Camp follows a populist format. Anyone can submit a topic to present on. So if you have a passion for Martha Washington's favorite recipes, World War I battles, or genealogical software that will allow you to track your family tree all the way back to Adam and Eve, or any other aspect of history or how to practice it, you should consider coming to History Camp and sharing your passion with other like-minded lovers of history. On the day of the event, organizer Lee Wright and his assistants will organize the presentations into a schedule, and History Camp attendees will choose which presentations they would like to attend. I attended and presented at the first History Camp last year, and it was so much fun. I discovered many different and new techniques to present and interpret history. I also enjoyed the opportunity to meet others who shared my passion for the past. So if what I described sounds like an awesome day to you, check out History Camp at historycamp.org. And if the trip to Framingham, Massachusetts is just too far to travel, visit historycamp.org and learn how you can start a history camp in your hometown. And now for our conversation with François.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us today is François Furstenberg, an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. His research interests include the history of the United States between the 18th and 19th centuries. François is the author of 2 books, In the Name of the Father, Washington's Legacy, Slavery, and the Making of a Nation, and, most recently, When the United States Spoke French, 5 Refugees Who Shaped a Nation. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, François.
Thank you.
So today we will discuss French influence on early American life, culture, and politics using details from your book, When the United States Spoke French. And I have to admit, when I first saw your book, I read the title and I said to myself, was there ever a time when the United States spoke French? But when I read your book, I was pleasantly surprised because at least in the early republic, not everybody may have spoke the French language, but they certainly spoke French culture.
That's right. I mean, the title is a little bit metaphorical. It's not meant to indicate that everybody spoke French, but it is meant to suggest that there is a kind of French past or Francophone past that people don't really think about, and it was particularly strong in this period after the American Revolution, when, of course, the French were the great allies of the United States, and before the kind of diplomatic falling out of the late 1790s between France and the United States. And this really was a moment when Americans of all stripes, not just the elite, although certainly the elite, but also way down the kind of social scale, were really turned towards France, French culture, French trade, French goods that they were consuming, all kinds of things. So it's really this kind of interesting moment when you can kind of recover a past that many people have forgotten about.
So how did you come to investigate this special moment and follow the lives of 5 French Revolution refugees who settled in the United States during the 1790s?
I guess part of it is a little autobiographical in a sense. When I was finishing my dissertation, I was focused on that work, which was, as you mentioned in the introduction, on George Washington, and it was a very kind of American-centric topic. And I was searching around for a project that would come after that one. And this was a moment when a lot of historians were getting increasingly interested in what they called the Atlantic world and exploring connections between colonial America and the early Republic and the larger kind of Atlantic world, that is to say Europe, Africa, Latin America, these connections and circulations. So there was a kind of intellectual context at work here, that this was some really exciting work coming out. And then the autobiographical context is that I got a job at the University of Montreal, which was a Francophone institution, and I moved to a corner of America that I had never known before, and which actually did speak French. Here was a part of America that spoke French, and so trying to connect my own research on the United States with broader kind of Francophone tendencies seemed like something that would be interesting. It would allow me to create some bridges with my colleagues and with my students, and so this seemed like a really interesting topic for me to explore during the time that I was living there.
Well, let's talk and investigate this broader context. In 1789, France erupts in revolution, but that's as far as I can take us. Would you provide us with a brief overview of the French Revolution? What happened that 5 of its well-known early revolutionaries had to seek protection and refuge in the United States?
What I think is a certain, it's the less famous part in a sense of the French Revolution, which is to say the really early stages when revolution breaks out in 1789. And there's this period for a couple of years where the revolution is a very, it's seen as a kind of moderate revolution. And the people at the forefront of the revolution are people like Lafayette, who were inspired by the American Republic that had broken out, that had emerged a decade earlier across the Atlantic. And they were also very impressed with British system of government, with a kind of constitutional monarchy. And so they're enemies of absolutism. They're enemies of the kind of state that had existed in France before 1789. But they're not radical Republicans in the sense that, like the people who will emerge a little bit later in the 1790s. I think of them really as kind of centrists. So they're sort of George Washington types in many ways. And the kind of government that they try to implement in France in these early years of the French Revolution is a constitutional monarchy. Now, that doesn't succeed. They're at the forefront. So these are people like Lafayette. In fact, one of the characters who I look at is Lafayette's brother-in-law. His name is Noailles. And these are all people in that mold. They're descendants of the nobility in France, the French nobility, but they're liberals. So they're not kind of reactionaries siding with the Ancien Régime, and they're not like the sans-culottes who are already mobilizing on the streets of Paris. They try to situate themselves in between these two, what they consider these two extremes. And for a whole series of complicated reasons, that the center can't really hold in France. And they're chased out of France by 1792. They flee to England first, and then when war breaks out between France and England in 1792, they flee then to the United States. 1793, my apologies, they flee to the United States.
So if these men don't flee, and specifically we're talking about the 5 men you follow in your book, that would be Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Duc de Liancourt, Louis-Marie Vicomte Noailles, Moreau de Saint-Méry, and the Comte de Volney. And I apologize if I mispronounce their names. Oh. But if these centrists don't leave because they want a constitutional monarchy, are these the guys that are going to face the guillotine?
They would have had they stayed in France. There's every reason to think that they would have. In fact, Liancourt's cousin, who was the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, was killed. He wasn't killed at the guillotine, but he was killed in the streets Paris by Parisian crowds. And in fact, there's every reason to think that they would have been arrested. In 1792, in late 1792, there's what they call the September massacres, which are moments when aristocrats who'd been thrown in jail were killed. And so they were fleeing the violence, really the political violence that was going on.
So why do they opt to seek refuge in the United States? You mentioned that they had gone to Great Britain. It seems like they could have gone to the Netherlands or Spain or Italy or some other country in Europe. But why did they settle in the United States?
Many of them had fled. I mean, three of them of the figures who I follow had fled first to England. So they had important connections in England. They had friendships that allowed them into life in London. And they had to leave England when war broke out between France and England in early 1793 after the king's execution. And they were viewed suspiciously by the British government. Although they had fled France, they had been involved in the early stages of the French Revolution. And so the British passed an Aliens Act, which in many ways is the model for the Alien and Sedition Act that the U.S. will pass a few years later. And that expelled French refugees. Now, they of course could have gone to other parts of Europe, as you suggest, and I think that the reason that they went to the United States is that they wouldn't have felt very comfortable in these emigre communities in other parts of Europe. In many of these other places like Koblenz or Turin, in Germany or Italy, these were centers of the kind of reactionary aristocrats, the people who'd fled at the very early stages of the French Revolution, who really wanted a restoration of the old regime, who weren't interested in the kind of moderate reforms, that the liberal reforms that my guys had been interested in. And so they were viewed as sort of traitors to their class, in a sense, by these people. And so the United States was a refuge where they weren't going to run into, or they were less likely to run into these kinds of people. And I think also they admired the American system of government. It was in many ways what, as I was saying earlier, what they had tried to implement in France and failed to implement in France. And so they thought that perhaps they thought that this would be a kind of welcome place to spend a few years. None of them intended to leave permanently, but they understood themselves as exiles or as refugees or as emigres.
Boy, it sounds like they were in a tough political position because they're too conservative for their home country of France, and they're too radical to go to any of the existing monarchies in Europe because they've advocated overthrowing the Ancien regime and the monarch, at least revising the monarchy in France. So they come to the United States. Did the United States and France's alliance during the American War for Independence also play a role in why they settled in the U.S.?
I think to a certain extent. I mean, it put the American government into an awkward position because of course, when the United States had established its alliance with France, this was with the French king. The French king was no more, particularly after his execution. Of course, he was killed. So there was some debate about in the United States. Hamilton, for instance, was advocating this side about whether the United States was even still in alliance with France. That is to say, they had made an alliance with the French king, and did that alliance still hold with the new revolutionary government? Now, the Washington administration decided not to take that position. They decided to take the position they were still allied with France. But these were people who were, in a sense, enemies of the French state, or at least the French state considered them. They didn't consider themselves that way, but the French state considered themselves that way at this point in 1793 and 1794. And so it put the Washington administration, it put George Washington himself into quite an awkward position because he wanted to welcome these people. He had been, in some instances, he'd been friends with some of them, like Noailles, who had fought in the American Revolution, but he didn't want to be too close to them because this might pose real difficulties in the context of their diplomatic relationship with the then existing French regime.
So Washington and the United States allow not just these 5 revolutionaries that you follow, but many French refugees to settle within its lands. But what surprised me is that in your book, you point out that many of them settled in Philadelphia. So, Francois, why Philadelphia? They could have settled in Boston, New York, Charleston, or elsewhere, but they chose Philly.
Philadelphia was, I think, almost an obvious place for them to come to. At the time, it was the political capital of the United States, so it's where the center of government was. It's where all the major political figures were living. It was also the biggest city in the United States at the time. New York hadn't yet surpassed Philadelphia in the size of its population. It was the many ways the cultural capital of the United States, where the major scientific societies were found, a major newspaper center, and it was a huge port. I mean, it was the locus of a whole lot of trade between the United States, France, and especially the Caribbean and the French islands in the Caribbean. So this was an obvious place for them to come to, even if they were just following the kind of shipping routes. They would have almost inevitably landed in Philadelphia. But this would have been the closest thing they could find to a kind of metropolis, to a Paris, in the ways that England has London or France has Paris as their main metropolis. At the time, Philadelphia would have been the closest equivalent. Now, of course, it was nothing like Paris or London at the time. It was a very relatively small town compared to those cities, but it was the closest thing they could find.
So Philadelphia is not Paris, especially in the 1790s. Could you give us an example of maybe what one of the refugees thought or wrote about when he entered Philadelphia, as he's fresh off the boat?
Well, you have to keep in mind that they were fleeing political violence abroad, and they hadn't exactly chosen, although as you say they had alternatives, they hadn't exactly chosen to. They felt forced to come to the United States, so they weren't already coming in the best frame of mind. But almost all of them comment with no small, I would say, level of contempt, even in some cases a little bit of disgust at the conditions they find there. It seems like a very rustic place. The docks are muddy, it's dirty, it smells. It's one of them, I think it's Talleyrand, but I'm not sure, or maybe Volney, comments on the sort of uniformity of the architecture. What we love to see when we go to the old part of Philadelphia, the 18th century part of Philadelphia, is these old kind of quaint brick houses. To them, it seemed incredibly boring and uniform, and these straight streets in perfect parallel and perpendicular lines felt sort of mind-numbing to them. They would wander around, not know which street they were on because they all looked the same. So there wasn't much redeeming, at least architecturally, that they found when they arrived. They were largely, I would say, a little bit disappointed.
And what did they do when they got to Philadelphia? I mean, I find it hard to believe that some of these aristocratic gentlemen sought jobs. But did they seek jobs, make friends, and maybe dabble in trade or American politics?
Well, they were pretty out of place when they arrived. I mean, these are, as I said a little earlier, these are descendants. These aren't just French aristocrats. These are descendants from the upper echelons of the French nobility. I mean, these are some of the oldest and most distinguished and wealthiest French families from the old regime. And so they were, I would say wildly out of place in Philadelphia. This is not the kind of person you would typically run into on the streets of Philadelphia. When they arrived, they began establishing friendships. I mean, one of the things that they found when they came to Philadelphia was a huge French community. There were people not of their social background, but there were people who, many of them had come from France, but most of them had come up from the Caribbean. There were thousands of people who'd fled the violence in the Haitian Revolution and had come to the United States to take refuge for themselves. So there was this very large French community, and one of the things they found when they arrived in Philadelphia was that it was actually quite French. There were French stores, there were French bakeries, there was French theater, French newspapers, French booksellers. There were all kinds of things happening in France. So that was one of the first things that they found when they came to Philadelphia, and they did mix with this community to a certain extent. Although they seem to have been close to each other. They established this very tight-knit community among themselves in the midst of this larger French community. And many of the friendships they established were with wealthy Americans, kind of elite Americans who were really kind of excited to have them in their midst. And they immediately were bombarded with invitations to dinners or to balls or to tea, so that they could be, in a sense, shown off by the Philadelphia elite. These were people from who were familiar with the kind of norms of the court at Versailles, the things that had only sort of been heard of from a distance by wealthy Americans. And so this was something that was very exciting for them, for the Americans, and they were happy to have them there and to invite them to their social gatherings. So they established friendships. In economic terms, it was a little hard for me to piece together. Many of them came. Some of them seem to have come with some element of capital, and by capital I mostly mean letters of credit. They weren't really carrying sort of silver plates over, which would have been a very standard way of transferring wealth across the Atlantic when you fled. But they had letters of credit from wealthy Britons or wealthy Dutch bankers. They were able to live, quite relatively well off at the beginning. But gradually, as it became clear that they were going to spend a little more time in the United States, they began getting interested in investments in American land. They thought that they saw all this land for sale and thought this might be a real opportunity to reestablish some of their fortunes. So that was where they began dabbling. With one exception. One exception is Moreau de Saint-Méry, who's one of my characters. He doesn't quite fit the mold of the other characters in the sense that he wasn't descended from the French nobility. He came actually from the Caribbean. He was born in the Caribbean, but he became a lawyer, and he was involved in the early stages of the French Revolution. And like the others, he'd sat in the Constituent Assembly. When he came over, he came with his family, and he needed money more urgently. He really came with very little, and so he first worked as a clerk in a shipping firm, and then found through his friends he was able to gain some loans that he used to establish a bookshop in Philadelphia. So he became a kind of tradesman in Philadelphia, and he found the experience deeply humiliating.
You've raised so many great issues, and I want to talk about at least three of them: the culture, the political connections, and this economic connections with credit in Europe. So let's start with the culture. How did this French community, especially the one that you follow in Philadelphia, get the United States to speak French in terms of French culture? You said that they established bakeries and bookstores. How did Americans receive this culture, and how and why, or did they adopt it?
Well, there was a huge demand for French goods at this time. France had already established itself as the kind of pinnacle of refined taste for European culture. And this was true as much in England as it was in other parts of Europe. I mean, the court of the Russian Tsar spoke French in the court. So this was already a kind of well-established phenomenon. And Americans who in many ways felt themselves to be or had felt themselves to be kind of provincial Britons felt themselves to be part of this larger European culture. And now that they were established as Americans, they were seeking to kind of establish their cultural their cultural bona fides, if you. So there was a great demand for French goods, and there was an enormous amount of trade between the United States and the French Caribbean. After England, the French islands in the Caribbean were the largest trading partners with the United States. And after the Revolution, there had been this attempt by French and American authorities to encourage trade between the United States and France. Many Americans were still angry with Great Britain, and they wanted to establish kind of credit relationships and relationships of trade with France and with the French Caribbean. So there's a huge amount of trade at this point between the United States and the larger kind of French-speaking world. And this manifested itself after the arrival, in particular, of all these refugees from the Caribbean. This manifested itself in all these goods being manufactured and sold in Philadelphia. So one of the things that I learned as I was doing the research, which was both frustrating but also really fascinating, was that it's very hard to know exactly what, for instance, a French chair might be in Philadelphia in the 1790s. I mean, is it a chair that comes from France, or is it a chair that's manufactured by a French artisan who's living in Philadelphia, who's established himself in Philadelphia, or is it a chair that's based on French styles, which is being manufactured by an American? All three of those things are, in a sense, French chairs, and I just use chairs as the first thing that popped into my mind. But this is true of all kinds of goods and all kinds of architectural styles, all kinds of furniture and interior decorations. And so there's this real turn towards French culture in this period, and it manifests itself in this kind of world of material objects that surrounds Philadelphians and in many ways Americans.
Did this exploration and adoption of French culture help these early Americans find and start to form their new identity as Americans? I mean, they're no longer Britons.
I think in part that's right. I mean, they were looking for a kind of an identity that would be different from their past, which had been a British past in large part. I mean, of course, the demographic composition of the United States was quite different. But in certain parts of New England, for instance, people talked about New England as more English than England itself. So there's a search, to try to establish a past that's going to be different from the British past, or an identity that's going to be different from the British identity. And France provides an obvious opportunity for this because the French alliance was so important to the establishment of a nation. And it's a way of differentiating themselves in many ways from British. So the kind of diplomatic context, I think it's maybe a little hard to recapture this world. But the United States is really a puny power at this point. I mean, the United States is very small and operating in a world of giants. So France and Great Britain are really major powers, and so this diplomatic relationship is something that people feel in many ways. I think. I mean, it's not just important kind of diplomatically or geopolitically. It becomes part of an American identity, and to understand themselves as in an alliance with France is really to shape part of their American identity, and to shape party politics even. I mean, the first party system, which was between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, I mean, many people talked about them as the British Party and the French Party. I mean, so this really was part of the fabric of political and cultural life in the 1790s.
And let's move into politics. It seems that the refugees who enjoyed connections among elite merchants and politicians in Europe enjoyed similar connections in the United States. Would you provide us an example of how refugees like Talleyrand and Noailles gained access to Americans like Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson?
Well, these were eminent figures. They were well-known figures. They came armed with letters of introduction from eminent figures in England. So, for instance, when Talleyrand arrived, he came with a letter of introduction from the Marquis of Lansdowne, who had been the Prime Minister of Britain when peace was established between the United States and Great Britain, and had entered a correspondence with George Washington. So this was not a letter that you could sort of reject. I mean, Washington was kind of bound to read this letter and to take it seriously. And that's only one example. Many of them came with letters of introduction to many of these other figures, people like Hamilton, like Jefferson, and some very important merchants. I mean, international merchants were one of the major figures. People, like Robert Morris or William Bingham. These are important merchants in Philadelphia at the time, and they had important trading connections with other parts of the world. When the French, when my French emigres arrived, they came with these connections already established between eminent figures in Europe and eminent figures in the United States, and so they were able to kind of easily slip into this world. And it also, as much as these were social connections, they were also political connections and economic connections.
You mentioned letters of introduction. Could you tell us what a letter of introduction is and who was introducing who to whom?
Yeah, I mean, I became really fascinated with this genre while I was doing the research for this book, because travel, I guess we don't maybe think about it often enough, but travel is just incredibly difficult in the 18th century. You travel these long distances. It takes about 6 weeks to cross the ocean. Sometimes if conditions were difficult, it could take a good deal longer than that. And you arrived in places where you knew nobody, and you didn't, of course, know what people looked like, right? I mean, passports, there's no photo in a passport. A passport is just a letter that describes someone's features. So this is, in many ways, although it's a smaller world. I mean, the cities are much smaller. In other ways, a more anonymous world, in the sense that you don't know what to expect, and you don't know where to go. There are no there are maps, but it's not like you don't have your GPS to tell you where to go or something like that. So, and you had no real context. So letters of introduction become this important tool for forging contacts in this world of circulation when people actually move around. So, to give a concrete example, I mean, I talked about Lansdowne's letter to George Washington. There are many examples of this. Very typically, it would be somebody who already had an established relationship with somebody abroad. So, for instance, if you were traveling to Paris, and I know you, and I have a brother in Paris, or I'm a merchant and I have a merchant in Paris who I typically work with, or I have lived in Paris and I established friends in Paris in the past. Well, I know you, Liz, so I'll write you a letter to my friends or to my business contacts or to my family in Paris, and I'll say, "Dear so-and-so, you'll find this letter delivered to you by Liz Covart, who is well known to me. Please give her your warmest welcome and respectfully yours, blah, blah, blah." I mean, it might be a little more formal than that or a little more polite than that, but that's effectively the thing. And so when you arrive in Paris, you'll have a stack of these letters from me and from a few other people, and you'll go to deliver these letters. That's one of the first things you'll do when you arrive in Paris. You'll deliver these letters to the people to whom they're addressed, and you'll hand it to them, or you'll hand it to their butler or something like that, and they'll get delivered, and then they'll welcome you. This will usually generate, at the very least, it'll generate an invitation to a tea or something like that. Ideally, it will generate an invitation to dinner, where you'll meet other people, and you'll be introduced to a local circle of friends, and this is how friendships get established and contacts get established. And these people can now help you. They can help you find lodgings, or they can help you. They can help, of course, introduce you to other people, and help you navigate this new city that you don't know at all, that is completely unfamiliar. So, in the absence of things, the whole infrastructure that we have today, like guidebooks and hotels and all these kinds of things, these become very important tools for forging relationships.
So these letters of introduction are basically like favors. Hey, I need a favor. This is my friend. Can you help them out? While they're visiting you. That's really interesting. It provides, a lot of personal connections. It shows how connected the 18th and 19th century worlds were.
Yeah, and I mean, it works both ways too. I mean, I think ideally my correspondent would be interested to meet you, and so this will be, something that it's a favor in a sense on both ends, but it's certainly more of a favor to the person who's doing the traveling. But they know now that they can send somebody to you when they have a friend coming to this side of the other. So it works both ways.
So this is, the 18th and 19th century version of social media, social networks, and the World Wide Web of personal connections.
That's exactly right. And I mean, I wondered a little bit about this as I was doing the work, because in the book I call these networks. I mean, and this is, the networks are something that scholars today are really interested in trying to understand how these past and unfamiliar worlds worked. And I think it's no coincidence that networks have become this kind of buzzword in academia at the same moment where they're this important, the age of the social network or something like that. So I even tried to, in the book, I tried to graph out what these networks would have looked like, these actual connections with a series of pictures and portraits and lines between the portraits establishing who was introduced to whom, or trying to visualize that. And there was something maybe a little Facebooky about the way that worked, but I think there is an interesting kind of analogy to be drawn.
So armed with these letters of introduction, your well-connected European French refugees settle in the United States and they gain access to men like Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson. What did they do with these connections? Because during the 1790s, the United States is trying to steer a course around fighting that's going on between Great Britain and France. Did the French refugees attempt to guide politics of the United States away from this policy of neutrality? I
mean, it's a really good question, and in many ways, this was the original question that kind of drove some of this research, because I thought that I would, by following the emigres, I would be able to understand this diplomatic and political world from a new way. I might be able to see how American diplomacy is being forged in this period. Now, it didn't pan out. When the refugees arrived, they didn't throw themselves into politics in this way. They had already fled France. Many of them had already fled England. They'd been kicked out of 2 countries already. And at this point, I think they just want to stay put. So they don't become advocates for one policy or another. They feel loyal to France or to their idea of France. They intend to return to France, but they also feel, of course, very alienated from this particular government. Some of them had family members who were actually killed in France while they were in the United States. Noailles' wife was executed while he was in the United States. So they don't have any great love for the revolutionary government, but they don't have any warmth for Great Britain either. I mean, they consider Britain is at war with France, and they consider Britain to be the enemy, although they are, of course, friends with many British people. So they take, in many ways, the same kind of neutral position that the United States is taking. I talked a little bit about earlier about how puny a power the United States is in this time. And George Washington's great objective at this point is to keep the United States out of war. And what that means, the United States was in a treaty with France, a treaty of alliance and commerce that had been established during the American Revolution, and it obliged the United States to side with France in the next war with Great Britain, because that is largely what had been envisaged in the treaty. Now, that didn't mean kind of sending an army over to Europe to fight on the battlefields there. What it meant was providing assistance to the French Navy in their Caribbean operations, arming privateers that were in American ports to support the French. And Washington, very controversially, established neutrality. He contravened the terms of the treaty and declared that the United States would remain neutral in this war between France and Britain. And I think the emigres who I followed, they really did try to stay out of politics. I mean, they weren't at least in the early years that they were in the United States. They tried to stay out of politics. They didn't enmesh themselves in these kinds of very partisan debates. But I think on the whole, they were sympathetic to this position of neutrality, because it was on a much smaller scale their own position.
So we've discussed culture, we've discussed French influence, these emigres' influence on American politics. Let's talk about land and economics. I really want to discuss the Louisiana Territory, because what you had to say about the Louisiana Territory was what I thought was one of the most interesting parts of your book. But before it seems like we can get into Louisiana, we really need to at least briefly talk about the Haitian Revolution. Would you provide us with a brief overview of the Haitian Revolution and its connection with France and its revolution?
Well, the Haitian Revolution, in certain ways, the Haitian Revolution comes out of the French Revolution. Of course, it has its own logic and its own social background. I mean, the Haitian Revolution is about slavery fundamentally. Haiti had been the French colony of Saint-Domingue during the 18th century. That's what it was called, and it was the most important French colony. In fact, it was really the most important Caribbean colony or European colony for any European empire. It produced enormous amounts of sugar, coffee, indigo, and other commodities for the European market. And it really was a pillar of the French economy. I mean, it genuinely is hard to exaggerate the importance of Saint-Domingue to the French economy and to the French Empire in this period. So the stakes are very important. And what was driving this economy was hundreds of thousands of slaves who were producing all these commodities. So there were about 500,000 slaves in Saint-Domingue by 1789 when the French Revolution broke out. And the French Revolution, there's a whole background, which is a very complicated one, about the gens de couleur. There are free people of color in Saint-Domingue, about 30,000 free people of color who many of whom had great wealth. And there's roughly 30,000 whites in Saint-Domingue in this period, so roughly equivalent population of white and people of color. People of color, gens de couleur are people who are of mixed ancestry, typically mixed French and African, and so they had been gradually losing rights over the past 20 years. There had been really an attempt to establish greater hardening racial lines in Saint-Domingue. So there's a great deal of unhappiness and unrest among this powerful population of gens de couleur, and this sort of boils over as the French Revolution begins, because the French Revolution has this important language of equality and of liberty, and the gens de couleur, the free people of color, begin demanding equal rights in Saint-Domingue, and this launches. I'm making a very, very long story very short, too short, but this launches a war basically between the gens de couleur and the free whites from this period in 1789 to 1791, and what's really kind of almost fascinating from our perspective is that you have 30,000 whites kind of battling 30,000 gens de couleur. I mean, not all of them, of course, but from a broad perspective. And they're surrounded by 500,000 slaves who are deprived of all their rights, and who are living in the most grueling and unbelievable conditions. And there's almost no recognition that these claims to liberty and to equality being made by all sides are going to might have an impact on the slave population. And in particular, the kind of social unrest creates openings for slaves to begin to assert their rights. So in 1791, this begins to blow up. There are huge insurrections in the northern plains, on the northern part of Haiti, the richest part of the sugar producing regions of Saint-Domingue. At first, it's really an insurrection. The slaves they're demanding reforms of conditions in slavery, the abolition of the whip, greater time for themselves, fewer work hours. But over the course of the years that follow, this becomes a revolution. It becomes a revolution for the abolition of slavery itself, which is established in 1793 and 1794, so that by 1794, even the French government has to recognize that slavery has been abolished in Saint-Domingue, and they now abolish slavery in the French colonies as a response to the conditions in Saint-Domingue. So this overturns really the French economy. It overturns the labor system on which a large part of the French economy depends. And a major objective for France at this point is to keep these islands under French control, to avoid them falling into British hands, and to try, insofar as possible, in the absence of slavery, to reestablish production of sugar and coffee and indigo and the other crops that have been so important to the French and indeed to the American and European economies.
And this story, of course, brings us to the Louisiana Territory, because we have actually a big story arc here. We have the American Revolution and France's help with that. Then we have the French Revolution also seeking its own form of democracy and new government, freedom and equality. And these sentiments spill over into Haiti, which was Saint-Domingue at the time. This is a very important sugar-producing colony. It produces a lot of wealth for France. And France had known that, it had done that for years, and France had wanted to establish a big foothold in North America with its Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the United States in 1778. That's one of the big reasons France helps the United States out during its war for independence, is because it wants help guarding Saint-Domingue and its other Caribbean possessions. But the French really never get the degree of influence they desire. The Americans never really give them the foothold that they need. So in 1800, Napoleon tries to remedy this situation. He's trying to better protect France's Caribbean possessions and gain the foothold in North America that the Americans have denied them by purchasing 530 million acres of Louisiana Territory from Spain. So, Francois, why did Napoleon want the Louisiana Territory? I mean, it's one thing to have possessions in the Caribbean, but now he wants possession in North America.
You know, what you outline is exactly right. So that is to say the importance of the United States for France had always been, during the American Revolution and after, had always been connected to the Caribbean. That was one of the most fascinating parts of this research for me. I mean, this had never really occurred to me. I have to confess that there's really no such thing in this period as a kind of direct French-American relationship. I mean, this is what I was originally interested in, connection between France and the United States. But it became clear to me while I was doing this book that there is no direct connection between France and the United States. It all runs through the Caribbean. And just like so much trade runs through them, I mean, it kind of follows the shipping lines. So when France intervened in the American Revolution, as you said, it had been in large part, these had been kind of geostrategic objectives that had been to better protect their Caribbean possessions. The American colonies had provided enormous amounts of support to the British during previous wars. And France thought that by detaching the North American colonies from the British, the mainland colonies from the British, and establishing an alliance with those possessions, they would much better protect the French Caribbean and, in fact, endanger the British Caribbean, the British islands. So this is, in many ways, this is all about the Caribbean, as you say, and the intention is to have the United States supply the Caribbean with provisions. They need all kinds of food. They need flour. They need lumber, which is hugely important for running plantations. And running these sugar mills, and of course naval bases of support in times of war. So this had been the original objectives, and unfortunately for the French, they hadn't really panned out. Washington had declared neutrality once war between France and Britain reemerged. In fact, the American regime, at least to the French eyes, it seemed to be increasingly allying with Great Britain over the course of the 1790s. They established a new peace treaty with the British, the Jay Treaty, which was a hugely controversial treaty in the United States. It seemed to the French authorities that in the moment when they most needed this alliance with the United States, the United States had abrogated the alliance and turned back into an alliance with Great Britain. So by the late 1790s, the early 1800s, Napoleon is in power, and he looks at this situation, and he decides that he really needs a new base of support for the French Caribbean, one that the French had hoped to find with the United States, but hadn't been successful at finding. So that was why he turned his eyes to Louisiana in large part. Louisiana would do what the United States had been meant to do. It would furnish supplies for the Caribbean, flour, lumber, all these kinds of things. It would provide bases of naval support. I mean, Louisiana is in the Gulf of Mexico and is right next to the Caribbean. And it would accomplish all the objectives that the French had hoped to achieve with the United States. And that really was what motivated the French and what motivated Napoleon in the end to reacquire Louisiana. Louisiana had been Spanish since the end of the 7 Years' War. So
Napoleon wants to settle Louisiana. He has designs on at least putting a colony there.
Yeah, I mean, the objective is to establish French control of New Orleans. I mean, of course, the population in New Orleans and throughout much of the Mississippi Valley had remained French. Very few Americans were living in this territory, and mostly it was Native American and French, and so it was understood that it would be easy to reestablish French sovereignty on the territory. You would send some kind of army to New Orleans and reestablish the forts that up and down the Mississippi River, reestablish the alliances with Native Americans that were in many ways still Native Americans in this region who were really the dominant population. Many of the nations in the region, the Native American nations in the region, were hungering for an alliance with France, which might help prevent or at least into the territory. So this was seen by Native Americans as a positive thing.
Well, let's continue this interesting conversation in the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
So to follow up on my last question, in your opinion, what might have happened if Napoleon had sent his army to Louisiana instead of Haiti in 1801 and 1802? Do you think the French would have secured a foothold on the North American continent, and what would the map of the United States look like today?
I mean, I love this question because I think it's one that I sort of puzzled over while I was thinking about this whole larger context. In fact, Napoleon did send an army to Louisiana. I mean, the army, he sent roughly a total of 80,000 troops across the Atlantic between 1800 and 1802. And this was an army that was destined for Louisiana. But Napoleon made the huge strategic mistake of deciding that before they reached Louisiana, he would seek to reestablish slavery on Saint-Domingue, reestablish a firm French control on Saint-Domingue and pull it back into the empire and reestablish slavery. And so he thought that would be a fairly straightforward objective. The French army, this huge French army that he sent across the Atlantic would do that and then move on to Louisiana and secure French Louisiana. But it didn't work out that way. The former slaves refused to be re-enslaved, and a really vicious war followed, which between war and disease killed off Napoleon's army. It died essentially before it could reach Louisiana. So it would have been quite simple for Napoleon to decide to ally with Saint-Domingue, with Toussaint Louverture, who was in charge of Saint-Domingue at this point, establish the kind of alliance that they'd hoped to establish with the United States earlier, and send that army to New Orleans. And this was a huge army. France at this point was the dominant military power in Europe. They were marching across Europe and conquering huge amounts of territory. The United States didn't have an army to speak of. I mean, it had a very small army which had enormous difficulties emerging victorious over Native Americans in the Northwest, and they would have had really, I think, no chance against a French Native alliance in the Southwest, a really robust French Native alliance in the Southwest. So then you begin to wonder what would have happened if this would have created, I think, a buffer zone in the Southwest to protect Native territory. In the Southwest, it would have prevented American expansion into what became the Cotton Belt: Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, this whole territory. Then imagine a Napoleon allied with Toussaint Louverture, with an abolitionist regime. Imagine a mixed army, because that's what it would have been had Napoleon taken this course. That's what it had been in the Caribbean in the 1790s, a mixed racial army of former slaves and Frenchmen fighting the British to great success in the Caribbean in the 1790s. And had this multiracial army moved into Louisiana, we can only imagine how that would have destabilized slavery in the United States. So in the already existing plantation belt, the rice belt in South Carolina, and the tobacco regions in Virginia, and if slavery hadn't been allowed to expand into the Southwest, it would have been very hard to maintain slavery. I mean, it was already tobacco region, which is where the vast majority of slaves were in the Chesapeake in this period, and the tobacco crop was in huge decline in the 1790s. The soils were becoming exhausted, and there was already a huge surplus of enslaved labor in the Chesapeake. And had they not been able to move into the Southwest, there were roughly a million enslaved people who were transported from the Chesapeake into the Southwest. Had they not been able to move into the Southwest, it's hard to imagine how slavery would have been economically viable as an institution. So, you can go very far in this kind of fantasy world, but it's really fascinating to think about, and it's fascinating, I think, to think about how contingent all of this was. I mean, this massive expansion of slavery into the Southwest, which ultimately, of course, entrenched itself so powerfully that it led to the Civil War, really was very, very contingent. I mean, it might all have come out very differently with a few different strategic decisions by Napoleon.
Well, you've left us with a lot to consider and think about. I mean, would the United States have had a civil war? Would it have expanded to California? Would more than half of the North American continent be speaking French right now? I mean, these are all things we can consider just based on those ideas. But before we conclude, would you tell us about what you were working on now?
Well, I'm still kind of recovering from the book at this point. It's an exhausting process, but I have a few smaller projects that I'm interested in. While I was doing the research for this, I became really interested in Frederick Jackson Turner, who's mostly known as a historian of the frontier, but he had edited these documentary collections that I used a lot in the research for this book, and became really interested in why he had edited this. These were diplomatic correspondence among the French and the Americans, and it's actually in French. And Turner edited this French language correspondence. And so this got me very interested in Frederick Jackson Turner. So I'm working with another historian, Eric Hinderacher, who's mostly a Native American historian. We're working together on a little book. It's going to be this time a very small book we both want, on Frederick Jackson Turner and thinking about him in different contexts. And I also have a little collection of George Washington's writing, editing right now for a textbook publisher. These are some smaller projects as I kind of begin mustering up the courage and the energy for a bigger book.
Well, we wish you the best of luck with those little projects and with your future unknown bigger project. Where's the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
I guess I have a webpage on the Johns Hopkins History Department website, and it's easy to find my contact information there and more details about the books.
Well, Francois, thank you for helping us explore how the United States spoke French. We enjoyed having you on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a really fun conversation.
So, parlez-vous Français? As Francois showed us, many Americans certainly did. If not linguistically, they spoke French in terms of French culture. And that's because after the War for Independence, many Americans struggled to figure out what American culture was. So they experimented with and adopted many forms of French culture to see what suited them and their new American identity. And to think, if Napoleon hadn't sent his army to Haiti to crush Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, then it is quite possible that many Americans west of the Mississippi River would be speaking French right now. And that's an interesting thought. You can find information about Francois, his book, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode. You'll find it all at benfranklinsworld.com/017. Don't forget to check out History Camp 2015. I've included a link on the show notes page for this episode to make it easier for you. But in case you'd like the link right now, it's historycamp.org. I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate this podcast. Your rating and review will help us keep Ben Franklin's World visible and findable for new people. To rate and review Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history, just visit benfranklinsworld.com/iTunes or benfranklinsworld.com/Stitcher. And finally, what aspect of French culture do you think the United States and its culture has benefited from? Let me know your answer by sending me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, or by tweet @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.